Today we're going to learn a fascinating area of halacha. It has to do with an Eruv Tavshillin, which you prepare in order to be able to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos, and how that compares to the Eruv Chatzeros, which we use in order to be able to carry within a particular area that Derabanan we would not be allowed to carry. Now, the food that is designated for either Eruv is eaten at some point, and we'll notice a nuance in the difference between when they are eaten. Specifically in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, we're going to explore why the Alter Rebbe makes that distinction, because it turns out that there are two completely different approaches to understanding what an Eruv Tavshillin does, and that teaches us two different approaches in our Avodas Hashem, represented broadly by the difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov. So Eruv Tavshillin is the din. The halacha about Eruv Tavshillin is as bald nachdem we meendig zugreiten alle tzarche Shabbos, that as soon as we've prepared all of the food that we need for Shabbos, megmen ufessen dem Eruv, we're already allowed to eat the food that was designated for the Eruv Tavshillin, nachin and tog von Yom Tov, even if it's still Yom Tov and Shabbos hasn't started. That's what we're allowed to do. But what do we do in practice? We'll see two of the leading opinions in Minhag Ashkenaz say differently. Steht aber im Maharil, there's the first one. As hat eingeführt, his custom was la'niach kikor Eruv Tavshillin lelechem mishnah beleil Shabbos. What he would do is he would keep the bread used for the Eruv Tavshillin and use it as part of the lechem mishnah on Friday night, and then over Shachrisoi, part of the lechem mishnah the following day. Over Suda Shlishis hoyabetzeah olav, and then he would actually eat it at the third meal on Shabbos afternoon. On Azoi bringt euch the Marshal. There's the second opinion. So the Marshal says, really, by rights, the food of the Eruv Tavshillin should last into Shabbos, so you shouldn't eat it before Shabbos. And even though you could technically eat it on Friday night, he quotes the Maharami Rottenberg, of course, one of the leading Ashkenazi halachists, that the hanicho akiko tachas halechem mishnah beleil Shabbos, that you keep the bread under the lechem mishnah on Friday night, and on Shabbos day, and at Suda Shlishis, then that's actually when the Maharam would eat the bread from the Eruv Tavshillin. And the reason he gives is because it was already used. This bread was used for a mitzvah to make an Eruv Tavshillin. It is appropriate to keep it for other mitzvahs, lechem mishnah, and Suda Shlishis. So that's both the Maharil and the Maharam. Now the Alter Rebbe says something which seems identical. The Alter Rebbe brings her up at the Minhag in Shulchan Aruch. The Alter Rebbe quotes us in his Shulchan Aruch and says, Lechatchila ideally tzorich shiyu apas v'atavshil shumurim etzloi ad lachashetikin kol tzorich Shabbos. The food that you designate as Eruv Tavshillin should remain intact until you have made all the necessary preparations for Shabbos. That's ideal. Or mitzvah min muvchar, even better than that. Even better than that is to retain the bread of the Eruv Tavshillin to use in one of the three meals as part of the lechem mishnah. As the Maharam said, anything that was already used for a mitzvah, ideally you should use it for, or it's appropriate to use it for another mitzvah. But then he says further, and some people have the minhag, so there's lechatchila, to keep it until Shabbos, mitzvah min hamuvchar, to use it as part of the lechem mishnah, and then yesh noyagin, there's a minhag, shelo liftzei olav suda gimel shel Shabbos, that you don't use the bread of the Eruv Tavshillin until the third Suda on Shabbos, Kidei lasis by mitzvahs harbe, to use it for many mitzvahs, Manichin ze'akikor lelechem mishnah b'Suda harishona b'Suda shniya shel Shabbos, that you use it for lechem mishnah twice on Friday night and Shabbos morning, and then over Suda shlishis boitzin olav, and then you actually use it to eat at the third Suda. Okay, so now where does this come from? How do we know that there's a value in keeping the food from the Eruv Tavshillin into Shabbos and eating it on Shabbos? So the mocha from the svara, the root, the source of this is the thinking that says once you've used something ready for a mitzvah, in this case Eruv Tavshillin, is it's ideal then to use it for other mitzvahs as well, like lechem mishnah and a Shabbos meal. Where do we learn that from? Is in Gemara. Something Gemara Brachas tells us, but there it's talking about by Eruvei Chatzeros, a slightly different kind of Eruv, the Eruv you use to be able to carry in an area of a whole lot of private homes. There the Gemara says, Rav Ami Rav Asi kavan misramalu rifta de Eruv. So Rav Ami and Rav Asi had the tradition that when they had access to the bread of the Eruv Chatzeros, everybody Yasma the Eruv Chatzeros, as Rashi tells us, the bread that was used to make the Eruv Chatzeros, they would mevorchen alei hamoitzi lechem min haaretz. They would use it as an opportunity on Shabbos to say the bracha hamoitzi, and they said Amri ho v'saveh b'mitzvah choda navet b'mitzvah chrisi. Seeing as it was used for one mitzvah, let's use it for another mitzvah. So there we have the precedent that generally something used for a mitzvah should be used for more mitzvahs, and the precedent comes from a very similar halacha, Eruv. Now you're going to see that the Maharil says something similar, and so does the Maharshal. Look what the Maharil says about the bread used for Eruv Chatzeros. Same thing. He uses that bread as part of the Lechem Mishnah on Friday night and Shabbos morning. And technically he says you could eat that bread already on the Friday night meal, but it's ideal to increase how many mitzvahs you do with it, and therefore practically so therefore the Maharil did what? He kept the bread of the Eruv Chatzeros to be part of the Suda Shlishis like Eruv Tavshillin. And as I bring the Marshal says the same thing. The same minhag that he quoted about Eruv Tavshillin applies to the bread of Eruv Chatzeros. Keep it for the third meal. As Mester says by the Suda Shlishis. Nachdem we make this to Lechem Mishnah by the zwei erste Sudas after we have already used it for Lechem Mishnah in the two preceding Sudas. Vi by Eruv Tavshillin exactly like Eruv Tavshillin. So the Maharil and the Maharshal are consistent in how they believe that we're supposed to behave with the bread of Eruv Tavshillin and Eruv Chatzeros. The Alter Rebbe does not apply the same consistency. But by dem din bringt the Alter Rebbe, when it comes to Eruv Chatzeros, there the Alter Rebbe says something differently. No, the Psak Halacha from Ramah, he only quotes the halacha as is brought in the Ramah, which is you should use the bread of the Eruv Chatzeros for your Lechem Mishnah in the daytime meal. Because if it's already been used for a mitzvah, the Eruv, you should keep it for another mitzvah, the Lechem Mishnah of the daytime meal. And he does not say that there's a value in keeping it specifically for the third meal in order to have many mitzvahs. If that's the case, we have to understand. But bald as the Maharil und der Maharshal, der Mon und der Minig sei bei Eruv Tavshillin und sei bei Eruv Chatzeros. Seeing as both the Maharil and the Maharshal both say the same minhag applies to Eruv Chatzeros and to Eruv Tavshillin. In other words, in both cases, you keep the bread ideally until Suda Shlishis. And Favos bringt Alter Rebbe the minhag nor by Eruv Tavshillin. So why then does the Alter Rebbe only say that when it's Eruv Tavshillin around Yom Tov time, then it is appropriate to keep the bread of the Eruv Tavshillin until the Suda Shlishis on Shabbos, and not Eruv Chatzeros? Especially if you think the logic behind it is, if something is used for a mitzvah, use it for more mitzvahs. Canal is not only logically applied to both of them, but it's something we learn from Eruv Chatzeros. So the principle of using the same mitzvah item for multiple mitzvahs is learned from Eruv Chatzeros, and that's dafka the one the Alter Rebbe does not say that we should use for multiple mitzvahs. Why not? Wenn man das versteht nachdem, wenn man wird bewohnen als Schwierigkeiten dem Etzem Minig zu bezählen seine von Eruv Tavshillin bei Suda Gimel Shel Shabbos. In order to answer this, we actually have to address another question, a lurking question over here, which is quite a big question. Why are we suggesting that there's an advantage to keeping bread until the third meal in order to increase mitzvahs? What's the logical flaw in this? In der ersten zwei Sudas von Shabbos ist doch der aggressive Shivas wenn der Suda Shlishis. Because we all know that the first two meals of Shabbos are definitely more significant than the third meal of Shabbos. And we'll prove this halachically, because like Kamadeyas darf man nicht haben kein Lechem Mishnah bei der Suda Shlishis. Many halachic authorities say that for the third meal of Shabbos, unlike the preceding two, you don't have to have two loaves of challah. You don't need Lechem Mishnah, implying it's a lesser meal. Not only that, noch mehr. Andere halten as die Suda Shlishis darf bechal nicht haben kein Pass. There are halachic authorities that say that Suda Shlishis doesn't need bread at all. Und es ist genug, you could have mezonos. B is as a sign of Frandeis, as misyoyts sein die Suda mit Peres v'chulei. In fact, there's an even more extreme opinion that says just eating fruit is sufficient for the third meal. So therefore, it doesn't really seem to make sense then, if the third meal doesn't need bread, why would there be a suggestion to keep the bread of Eruv Tavshillin? And according to the Maharil and the Maharshal, Eruv Chatzeros. Why keep it until the third meal dafka in order to dafka say the brocha over it? If we now see that eating bread at the third meal is not as valuable as eating bread at the first two meals and may not be required at all. Surely the logic should have been dafka. to use the bread of the Eruv at the daytime meal. Then not only would we have done the mitzvah of Lechem Mishnah with a mitzvah bread twice, but then eating the bread would itself be a mitzvah, because there's a Suda Shabbos mitzvah. And it's a Suda that everybody agrees you have to eat bread, so eating the bread would be an additional mitzvah. Now, Mekanet Zogan can't say as das, and to try and answer this, as das it's libdem was demot tutmen beim kikra dritte mitzvah. So let's not fall into the trap of believing that eating bread at Suda Shlishis is now a third independent mitzvah, Birchas HaMoitzi, by the Suda Shlishis, because he's saying the bracha HaMoitzi lechem min haaretz. And as if that's a mitzvah on its own, it isn't. By the Suda Shlishis is the Kamadeus Nitod Dechiyu from Pas. As we've illustrated, there are many halachic authorities who say you don't have to have bread at the Suda Shlishis. Is in employees do brichas hamoitzi al brichas hanenin. Then saying hamoitzi lechem min haaretz over that bread only fulfills the requirement to say a bracha over anything we benefit from. Well, if that's what you're getting out of the Suda Shlishis, guess what? When you made Lechem Mishnah out of it, in the second Suda, you'd actually have more mitzvahs, because you'd have the mitzvah of saying the bracha over the bread, which is equal both in the afternoon and in the morning, plus you'd have the mitzvah of eating a Suda Shabbos, which requires bread, which is only in the morning. So why would there be any suggestion to think that there's a value in having the bread of the Eruv dafka last you and eating it dafka at the third meal? So in order to understand that, we have to dig deeper and see that there are two views as to why we make an Eruv Tavshillin in the first place. So the beer and then explanation is in Gemara, in the Gemara Beitza, where the Iker discussion around Eruv Tavshillin happens. When gebracht zwei Time of that Akana von Eruv Tavshillin, there are two opinions about why we made an Eruv Tavshillin. And on examination, we're going to see that they're very different, and possibly even opposites. Aleph, Rava sagt, first you have the opinion of Rava, who says the purpose of the Eruv Tavshillin is to ensure that you have a decent serving of food on Shabbos as you have on Yom Tov, which means, a Pirish Rashi, the fact that you're making an Eruv while it is going into Yom Tov preparation, that will help you remember Shabbos, even though it might at this point be Wednesday, or if it's in Eretz Yisrael, it'll be Thursday. You'll still remember Shabbos. You won't use up all of your ingredients only to prepare Yom Tov food and leave Shabbos an orphan. So if you go with Rabbi's logic, is the Dakona von Eruv Tavshillin kedel harbes b'chvod Shabbos, and to use the language of the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi's intention, or explanation of the intention of Eruv Tavshillin, is to guarantee the honor of Shabbos. As opposed to Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi Yom Kadesh Yomru ein oifem Yom Tov the Shabbos. Rav Ashi says the whole reason we make an Eruv Tavshillin is to make sure that people know that you can't cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos, and then you'll understand Kal v'chomer Yom Tov l'chol, that you certainly cannot prepare food on Yom Tov for the weekday. On Loitim is the Tam Kedei Habes Bichvod Yom Tov, and therefore, again, to borrow the language of the Alter Rebbe, Rav Ashi's opinion is the Eruv Tavshillin preserves the dignity of Yom Tov, that it shouldn't be abused as a preparation day for the week. Now, there'll be practical halachic differences between the views of Rava and Rav Ashi, particularly around how early can you make your Eruv Tavshillin. So the Rosh offers one of the possible halachic differences between these two views. If you go with Rava's attitude and approach, which is that your focus is make sure you still have a decent menu for Shabbos. If the focus is when you're preparing Yom Tov, make sure you're conscious of Shabbos, then the only time to make the Eruv Tavshillin is on Erev Yom Tov. While you are on that day that you're preparing for Yom Tov, on the Erev Vetim Demonon in the Tzarche Shabbos, then you need an activity called the Erev to remind you to make sure that you're also looking after Shabbos. Because if theoretically you made the Erev an earlier day or a couple of days earlier, that would not be in your face to ensure that when you're preparing for Yom Tov, you will actually keep Shabbos in mind as well. Whereas if you go with Rav Ashi's view, which is that it is a reminder that you can't cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos, therefore definitely not from Yom Tov to the weekday, is genug blois dos was the Erev is kayim Erev Yom Tov. Then I just need to have the Erev sitting there as the reminder on Erev Yom Tov. But theoretically I could have prepared the Erev days in advance. Now here's where it starts to get very interesting. The Alter Rebbe bringt herav beide Taimim in Shulchan Aruch. The Alter Rebbe quotes both of these explanations, Rava and Rav Ashi in the Shulchan Aruch, but as we're about to see, he reverses the order. First, he tells us the first reason for an Eruv Tavshillin is to guarantee the dignity of Yom Tov, i.e., that you remember that you can't use Yom Tov as your preparation day for after Yom Tov. And then Habe is the second explanation, that it is also additionally to add value to Shabbos, that people remember that Shabbos should not be overlooked in all the frenzy of Yom Tov preparation. Now, then the Alter Rebbe also quotes the practical halachic difference we've just noted, whether you can make it in advance or not. And then he says this. Practically, you should make your Eruv Tavshillin Erev Yom Tov for this Yom Tov only. In other words, if it's like Sukkot, for example, not for Shmini Atzeres. Commotion is aligned with the second explanation, which is to be conscious of Shabbos. But what if you didn't do that? That you made the Erev already a few days in advance of Erev Yom Tov, and you forgot to do it on the day of Erev Yom Tov. The Alter Rebbe paskins that the person can rely on the fact that they made an Erev a few days earlier. It's not ideal, but it covers them. Das heißt, in other words, the Alter Rebbe is telling us that lichatchila darf man sich nöig sein zu bewahren euch dem Tam kedei sheyivrer mona yafel Shabbos chulei. What's Alter Rebbe telling us? Ideally, the way you construct your Eruv Tavshillin should be to keep your consciousness of the value and importance of Shabbos. But if you miss that and your Eruv only preserves the dignity of Yom Tov, it is also okay. Let's drill this down deeper. The Chelek zwischen die zwei Taimim is nicht nur zieh die Takone tzlib Yom Tov oder tzlib Shabbos. So it's not just simply as, okay, are we focused on protecting Shabbos, Rava's view, or are we protecting Yom Tov, Rav Ashi's view? No, nochmer in toichen atakona. Where actually the distinction over here is a whole different perspective on what the concept of Eruv Tavshillin is all about. Leuten tam von Rav Ashi's focus is at toichen atakona shlila. The whole reason we have it an Eruv Tavshillin is to avoid something inappropriate. And that is in Tzvei Pratim. There's two things that are necessary in order for this avoidance to happen, or two things we have to be conscious of. First of all, we have to avoid something which is forbidden, preparing on Yom Tov for after Yom Tov. Shlili, something which is negative. We have to make sure we protect people that they don't accidentally make the mistake of preparing food on Yom Tov till after Yom Tov, which is not allowed. So what's Rav Ashi's consciousness? Let's keep people from doing something wrong. Und therefore, because we're looking for something negative, let's stay away from a mistake. How do we apply it? We apply it by making something else that you can't do. You can't prepare on Yom Tov for Shabbos. Unless you make an Eruv Tavshillin, which basically means you've started the Shabbos preparation already before Yom Tov comes in. So Rav Ashi's entire perspective on Eruv Tavshillin is that it is for the purpose of avoidance, and therefore it is instituted in a way that it avoids something. Avoid cooking on Yom Tov for the week, and how do you institute an Eruv Tavshillin? You avoid cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbos. Rava's approach is complete opposite. The entire purpose of Eruv Tavshillin is to endorse something positive. And in both steps that we've just identified by Rav Ashi. First of all, what's the purpose? The first positive thing is you ensure that your preparation for Shabbos is proper, that Shabbos is given the attention it deserves. That you make sure you have a good menu for Shabbos too. And therefore, because the purpose is to endorse Shabbos, of a Mele Beis, as the Ikatakon is, das weglegen dem Erev, was der Mann dem Chiv zum Mechen sein, die Zeuche Shabbos. Therefore, how do you do it? Not by stopping an activity, but by creating something, an Eruv, which you will place in your home as the sign of remembering and honoring Shabbos. Und Rabbi, die Yusuf von Bishom Yom Tov Shabbos, Simon macht für dem Eruv. And therefore, from Rava's perspective, the prohibition against cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbos without an Eruv is not to verstärken die Takone von Achol Shabbos Kedeboy, is only to make sure that you prepare properly for Shabbos, not because we're afraid that you'll be disrespectful to Yom Tov. So now that we have this information, that Rava is coming from the perspective that the entire purpose of Eruv Tavshillin is to do something positive to endorse the dignity and power of Shabbos. And Rav Ashi's entire approach is that it's coming to avoid failure in an area with regards to Yom Tov. With that in mind, we'll understand another whole piece of the puzzle of Eruv Tavshillin, which is like this. The Gemara brings zwei Asmachtos from Pasuk Eif and Din from Eruv Tavshillin. The Gemara quotes two possible sources in the Torah that would support the concept of Eruv Tavshillin. Of course, it's not explicit in the Torah because it's Dirabbanan. Aleph, the one is Amar Shmuel de Amakra. Shmuel says, where's the support for Eruv Tavshillin? Because the Pasuk tells us, Zoch esem Shabbos lekadshoi, that you have to remember Shabbos to sanctify it, which he interprets to mean, Zochreu me'achasha bo lashkichoi. You have to remember it because there's certain circumstances where you might forget Shabbos, like if Shabbos coincides with Yom Tov, you might get caught up in Yom Tov and overlook Shabbos. That's the one opinion. The other opinion is Beis v'tana ma'aseh lemehocha, that the Gemara says that Tana learned it from a pasuk, which is actually in our parasha. Eis asher toifu eifu, that which you will bake, you should bake. Ve'eis asher tevashlu bashelu, and that which you will cook, you should cook. V'ashteit b'parasha sein, which is our parasha. Okay. Is mikan omer Rabbi Eliezer, from here Rabbi Eliezer learned ein oifen, you can't bake if it's Yom Tov for Shabbos, unless you already had something that was baked before. That gave support to the Takanas Chachamim of Eruv Tavshillin, which is Dirabbanan. Now, Shmuel's opinion, which is that Shabbos Akadsho is telling us you have to remember Shabbos in a situation where you may be liable to forget it, is Rashi Meforish. Rashi says, when is that? When Yom Tov is on a Friday, it's quite possible that you'll overlook Shabbos because of Yom Tov, because you're so busy making the big fancy Yom Tov Sudas that we tend to make, and you won't leave enough to give Shabbos its appropriate honor. Therefore, the Torah warns you that you better remember Shabbos. Says Rashi, Shmuel is telling us when you make an Eruv Tavshillin, you're remembering Shabbos. Now here is the part we have to pay attention to, because what's from Perish Rashi's move, and the way Rashi describes it, is as the Asmachta from Pasuk Zochus Yom Shabbos lekadshoi, the whole basis for an Eruv Tavshillin that Shmuel quotes from the Pasuk, remember Shabbos when it might be forgotten, is not letting time from Rava, only works according to Rava's opinion, because Rava says the whole purpose of an Eruv Tavshillin is to remember Shabbos in a situation where you may forget it. Now this is strange because for the Chayres Nitmuven doesn't seem to make sense. The Gemara bring beide timing. The Gemara quotes both opinions from Rava and Rav Ashi when behemshach to the asmachta from pasuk Zochis Shabbos lekadshoi, straight after telling us that this is the pasuk that supports the concept of an Eruv Tavshillin. Now Rashi has just illustrated to us that this pasuk works according to Rava's view. Und die zweite asmachta bringt die Gemara erst noch nach, bringen beide Timing von Rava und Rav Ashi. So isn't this interesting? The Gemara gives us this pasuk and Shmuel's interpretation that Zochis Yom Shabbos lekadshoi means if there's a situation where you may forget Shabbos, you have to make an effort to remember it. Therefore, we have support for the concept of an Eruv Tavshillin. Then the Gemara gives us Rava's opinion, which works perfectly with that. Then Rav Ashi's opinion, which doesn't. And only after that brings us Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. And Favos nimmt on Rashi. Das macht from Pasuk Zochis Yom Shabbos lekadshoi is letting time from Rava. So if Rashi sees that Zochis Yom Shabbos lekadshoi is the basis for an Eruv Tavshillin, and that's presented in the Gemara right in proximity of both Rava and Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, how does Rashi say so simply an explanation which seems to fit only with Rava's opinion? But Be'anal is move on based on what we have already explained. We'll get to understand how he knows this. The limud from the zweite Asmachta rückt aus die Takana in a von Shlili. Rabbi Eliezer's interpretation of how we have support in the Torah for the Takanas Chachamim of an Eruv Tavshillin is aligned with the approach of avoiding something negative. As his language says, Ein oifin, you cannot bake, ela al he'afoi chulei, unless you have already baked from before. In other words, we are forbidden to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos, unless you already have pre-prepared food for Shabbos from the day before Shabbos. So from the day before Yom Tov. Mashenke den Limud from Pasuk Zachas Yom HaShabbos LeKadshay, whereas Zachas Yom HaShabbos Direktois in an Oifen Chiyuvi is talking in a positive language. As Muzayin de Zachreu, we have to do something to remember, to endorse Shabbos. Und der Ribben nimmt on Rashi as das Machte von Zachas Yom HaShabbos LeKadshay. That's why Rashi can so simply tell us that Shmuel's opinion that the Pasuk Zachas Yom HaShabbos LeKadshay is the one that endorses an Eruv is like in time from Rava. That fits with Rava's opinion. As a takana from Eruv Tavshillin is an Inyan Chiyuvi who says that the entire purpose of an Eruv Tavshillin is to endorse and create something positive, which is that you'll make sure you have a good menu for Shabbos. Okay, so now that we have this information, we'll be able to work our way back to understanding how the Alter Rebbe says things. We have Rava's opinion clearly. Why is there an Eruv Tavshillin? To endorse Shabbos in a positive way, ensure that Shabbos is not overlooked, that Shabbos is given its fair place in society. Kemen zogen, as es hat anot like dem time zu halten ganz dem Eruv Tavshillin in dem Tag von Shabbos Gufa. If the purpose of an Eruv Tavshillin is to endorse Shabbos, then there's a logical reason to keep that Eruv Tavshillin when it is already Shabbos. Because what's its purpose? To endorse Shabbos, to augment Shabbos. So keep it there for Shabbos. Warum? Because, okay, Erev Shabbos, we've now finished our preparations for Shabbos. And therefore, we have now we've sorted out the possible problem of forgetting Shabbos, because we're not going to forget Shabbos now. We've done everything for Shabbos. We've done what we had to. So we don't have to worry that you might not leave enough to give Shabbos its honor. You're not going to use up all your ingredients for Yom Tov. That whole chash is gone. Which is why technically you could eat Eruv Tavshillin, because it's done its job. It's ensured we didn't overlook Shabbos. So even though we could eat the Eruv Tavshillin von deswegen, because as Rava tells us, the purpose of an Eruv Tavshillin is to bring a positive endorsement for Shabbos. Is mestaver as the zikarim mitzad Eruv so deira neichen Shabbos Kufa. Then there's logic to say, well, keep that positivity going through Shabbos. Keep that endorsement alive on Shabbos. Which would be the simplest interpretation of remember Shabbos to sanctify it, as Madav Gedenken Shabbos in Tog von Shabbos Kufa, which usually means remember Shabbos on Shabbos. So if Shmuel's asmachta to the concept of Eruv Tavshillin is from a pasuk where before we read about an Eruv Tavshillin, we always understood was about remembering Shabbos on Shabbos, and now we're applying that pasuk also to an Eruv Tavshillin, and with the perspective that it's there to make Shabbos stronger or greater, well then it makes perfect sense that the Eruv Tavshillin, which symbolizes this, should be on Shabbos too. The signon acher, to put this into different words, seeing as this is a Shabbos that stands to possibly be overlooked, is the Zoches Yom HaShabbos LeKadshay von dem Shabbos, the mitzvah to remember Shabbos on this Shabbos, is mitatosves hadgasha, needs extra emphasis, as das zolech sein durch an Eruv Tavshillin b'Shabbos. And how do you emphasize it more? By having the Eruv Tavshillin sitting there in your house in full view on Shabbos. Shloimar, as das etam, was steht in Mariel bei Eruv Tavshillin. That would explain what the Mariel tells us. That it's good to keep from Yom Tov to Shabbos, to halten dem Eruv the Shabbos, to keep the Eruv that you made before Yom Tov, and you needed it for Yom Tov, but to keep it now on Shabbos. Was von Stimas l'shein is mashmas does nicht nur mitzad and tam von hovisave mitzvah chodechulei. The way the Mariel says that there's a value in keeping the Eruv for Shabbos, and then besides that, there's another thing that once you've done a mitzvah over something, you should do more mitzvahs. But there's an inherent value in keeping Shabbos, in keeping the Eruv Tavshillin for Shabbos. And nochmer, it's a movement from Marot Tirna. You'll see this even more clearly in a more in the minhagim of the Marot Tirna, where he says that you should dafka keep the Eruv till Shabbos comes in. According to Rava's logic, this makes perfect sense. It's just halten dem Eruv Shabbos ahi sofen dem Zachreuf and Eruv Tavshillin. Keeping the Eruv Tavshillin into Shabbos only heightens the concept of remembering Shabbos. With all of that information, we can understand how the Alter Rebbe's choice of words in his Shulchan Aruch is so precise and why he distinguishes between Eruv Tavshillin and Eruv Chatzeros. By Eruv Chatzeros Shaibter, when he speaks about Eruv Chatzeros, he writes as follows: Ha'eruv ein tzorich liyaskayim ela bein hashmoshes v'chulei. In order to fulfill the mitzvah of Eruv Chatzeros, the Eruv only has to survive into the Bein Hashmoshes twilight period of Friday evening. And then, it would be nice, it would be good to keep it for Lechem Mishnah in your meal on Shabbos day, because of the logic which says when bread has been used for a mitzvah, it's good to use it then for further mitzvah. So you used it for the mitzvah of Eruv Chatzeros, now use it for the mitzvah of Lechem Mishnah. Was then from the Hemshech Haloshen is move on following the way that the Alter Rebbe presents us, we get as the hidur from Liftzayel of B'Shabbos Shachris, that the hidur, the preference of using that bread for your Lechem Mishnah on Shabbos morning, has nothing to do with what the halachic definition of an Eruv Chatzeros is. It's a complete side issue, which is, seeing you used it for a mitzvah, use it for another mitzvah. But there's nothing inherent about an Eruv Chatzeros that makes you want to have the dafka habit on Shabbos day. But Eruv Tavshillin is a completely different perspective, a completely different objective. Therefore, he says specifically, the most important thing is that you have to make sure that the Eruv Tavshillin survives until you have prepared the food for Shabbos on Yom Tov. And then, and then as far as the straightforward bare bones of the law are concerned, if you've prepared all the food for Shabbos, you may now eat the Eruv Tavshillin, even if it's still Yom Tov. Or mikol mokem, even though you can, mitzvah mina muvchar, that same mitzvah of Eruv Tavshillin, when it is done in the best way possible, would be lamtin melechol apas shel Eruv Tavshillin ad echad megimel sudas Shabbos kedei liftzoy olav. The ideal way to do the mitzvah of Eruv Tavshillin would be to keep that bread for one of the sudas of Shabbos. He doesn't say that if you used it for a mitzvah, now use it for a mitzvah. He's saying it's mitzvah min hamuvchar of the mitzvah of Eruv Tavshillin to keep it into Shabbos. And then he had that there's also a value once you've used something for a mitzvah to use it again for a mitzvah. Following the precision of the Alter Rebbe's language, you can understand as the the fact that people wait until it's one of the Shabbos meals to eat the bread of the Eruv Tavshillin is not just some kind of sidebar issue, in the mitzvah, in the inyan von Eruv Tavshillin, but it's actually the higher grade version of the mitzvah of Eruv Tavshillin. Why would that be? Well, we understand why it will be. By using the food of the Eruv Tavshillin practically for food of Shabbos, you're doing a far better job of remembering and valuing Shabbos, even at a time where Shabbos might have been overlooked. And the Alter Rebbe, that's why the Alter Rebbe says over here in Eruv Tavshillin, the ideal mitzvah is to wait to use it as part of the meals on Shabbos. Because the Alter Rebbe, even though he brings it as the second view, Rabbi's view is the second view, ideally he wants us to follow Rabbi's view, i.e. to do the Eruv Tavshillin in such a way that endorses Shabbos. If you only keep the Eruv Tavshillin until you've cooked all of the food on Yom Tov, and then you eat it, that's okay, because Rav Ashi's opinion is the first opinion, which is the biggest thing over here is to ensure that we don't make the mistake of thinking you can use Yom Tov as a prep day for the next day. But ideally, lechatchila mitzvah min hamuvchar, you should fulfill Rava's objective, which is that the Eruv Tavshillin should endorse your Shabbos, and therefore ideally keep it and eat it on Shabbos. V'bier hanal, wird euch sein verstandig, was der Alter Rebbe bringt der Nagel von Betzeh seine von Eruv bei der Suda Shlishis, nor by Eruv Tavshillin and not by Eruv Chatzeros. And now it makes great sense to us why the suggestion that you keep the bread of the Eruv all the way to the third meal is something the Alter Rebbe sees only as being relevant for the Eruv Tavshillin and irrelevant to the Eruv Chatzeros. Why? As we explained earlier, as Eruv Tavshillin is kedei laharbes b'chvoid Shabbos. If you go with Rava's view, which the Alter Rebbe considers an important factor, that the Eruv Tavshillin should endorse and give dignity to Shabbos, and that means that using the Eruv as part of your meal on Shabbos is part of how you remember Shabbos through the Eruv Tavshillin. Then the longer or the more I can use the Eruv Tavshillin over the course of Shabbos. By the Mishnah on Friday night and Shabbos morning as part of the Lechem Mishnah, or by the Dritte Livtzoyalav and Shabbos afternoon to actually eat it, then I'm only highlighting and emphasizing the remembering Shabbos even more. Every time we eat part of the food of Shabbos, which was prepared on Yom Tov, how do we prepare it on Yom Tov? Because of this Eruv. We're actually saying not only was this food prepared on Yom Tov thanks to the Eruv, but the Eruv is endorsing Shabbos every single time we eat that food because the Eruv accompanies it through all the meals. In other words, as long as you keep that Eruv Tavshillin bread at each meal, including the last one, the Suda Shlishis, from the Eruv Tavshillin mit kol tzorchei Shabbos, then we have linked the Eruv Tavshillin, which is supposed to make us remember Shabbos. We've linked that to everything that was necessary in the food preparation of Shabbos. All the way to the very last preparation, which of course plays out in the very last meal. Now, where's that relevant? By Eruv Tavshillin. Was mit Zadem Etzem Gedu von Zachrei bei Eruv Tavshillin is das Svara zu halten dem Eruv bis der Suda Shlishis. Because there is a whole segment of understanding what an Eruv Tavshillin is as a means of remembering Shabbos. It makes sense, keep it as in the Shabbos as much as possible. But when you're talking about an Eruv Chatzeros, where nothing about Eruv Chatzeros is to help us remember and endorse Shabbos. Therefore, there's no practical reason to keep the bread of the Eruv Chatzeros all the way to the third meal, because the third meal is technically not required. In fact, it makes more sense to use that bread as the Lechem Mishnah for the daytime meal, where it can actually fulfill another mitzvah, because the whole logic to keep it is to do more mitzvahs. Where will you do more mitzvahs? At the Shabbos daytime meal more than the Suda Shlishis meal. Because the daytime meal, everybody agrees, requires bread. Beautiful halachic insight. What's the lesson? The Hirav von dem Minyan Anal in Avodas Hashem. The Chelek zwischen Shabbos and Yom Tov is Mavur in Zohar. The Zohar makes a very interesting distinction between the nature of the holiness of Shabbos and Yom Tov as follows. Shabbos wird angerufen Kodesh. Shabbos is called holy. On Yom Tov is Mikro'ei Kodesh. Yom Tov announces the potential for holiness. So the Zohar explains, Yom Tov is a day that we invite or we draw into a space that was not already holy, we make it holy. So Shabbos is always on the seventh day of the week, whether we do anything or not, it's always going to be holy. Yom Tov, we have to see the new moon, announce Rosh Chodesh, and then we turn an ordinary weekday into Shabbos. We bring holiness into the space. Das heißt, men is mazm dem Kodesh nan odz man von Chol. In other words, we're bringing holiness into an environment, into a time that in and of itself was actually an ordinary day. Mashenkin Shabbos, whereas Shabbos is holy because Shabbos is holy. Doesn't need us. They'll say, in other words, the day of a Yom Tov in and of itself is related to and belongs to the mundane part of the world. Und die Avoida von Moyadei Hashem Asher Tikru Oisam, the Avoida of Yom Tov, which is days that we, Tikru Oisam is read, Atem, we will designate Eden Dafka, specifically Jewish people, to become Yom Tov. That means that our job on Yom Tov is to bring the holiness into the space. So by making the date on the calendar, and then on the date, as the day of Yom Tov should be not just eating like everybody else eats, eating meals in a holy fashion, as the expression goes. Tzaddik oichel eseva nafshay. Like Shlomo HaMelech says, a tzaddik eats to satisfy his neshama. That's the kind of eating we need to work to achieve on Yom Tov. Shabbos was his mikdash of ekayma. So therefore, Shabbos, which is a day that's holy inherently, mitzad atzmai, is kula kodesh. Ein bei pselis klal. It's a day that is absolutely holy and cannot produce anything of a wasteful nature. Mashenken Yontiv is felt from the midden, but on Yontiv, if we don't serve Hashem as we're meant to, even if it's an individual who doesn't serve Hashem as the person is meant to, the tikroisen from Besin is given b'shleimus, even though the Besin said it's Yontiv. They don't need you, right? It's Yontiv whether you like it or not. But if a person, an individual, does not behave on Yontiv like he should, as the pasuk says, Perish Chageichem, he could produce out of his Yontiv waste matter. And the Gemara says clearly, Perish Chageichem koma v'lo perish Shabbatchem. The concept of producing waste is something which is only shayach, can only happen on a Yontiv, not on a Shabbos. Sorry, not the Gemara. The Zohar says. The avoid is in atog was mit tzadatzmo is nito came perish of a man not tzadik echel seven nafshoy. So it's a day. Shabbos is a day that doesn't have waste. Yontiv is a day that does have waste. Therefore, Yontiv is you have to be a tzaddik in order to be able to eat in a way that fills the neshama. So, what's the distinction between Shabbos and Yontiv? Shabbos has holiness intrinsically. Yontiv has holiness if we're doing what we're supposed to. This is quite similar to what the Alter Rebbe says about the two different approaches of how a person creates nachas for Hashem. So one of the ways is by taking something that was negative and transforming it, taking a weekday, turning it into Yontiv. Like having a food product that of its own accord is too bitter or sharp to eat and it has to be somehow cured. Or like Shabbos, which is a day where there is no bad, and that's like a food product that is naturally sweet. So the distinction between Shabbos and Yontiv is Shabbos does not need us in order to have value, power, and spiritual potency. Yontiv does. With that in mind, we can re-explore the two possible reasons about why you have an Eruv Tavshillin in the first place. If you go with Rav Ashi's opinion, which is we're scared that people might abuse Yom Tov, so we need the Eruv Tavshillin to protect the dignity of Yom Tov. Is Teichen Takona Shlila, where, as we've mentioned, the entire concept of Eruv Tavshillin was to avoid something negative. Whereas Rava's opinion, which is the whole purpose of Eruv Tavshillin, is to strengthen and endorse Shabbos, which is something positive. Because Yom Tov is a day where we're engaging the part of the world that is naturally mundane and we're making it holy. Then Rav Ashi's view, which is that the Eruv Tavshillin protects Yom Tov, will fit into the broader picture of what Yom Tov is all about. So, we're trying to protect something which is naturally inclined to the negative, because it's a naturally weekday time. And therefore we have to protect it by making sure nobody abuses Yom Tov. Whereas Rava's opinion, which is the Eruv Tavshillin, is all there about strengthening and endorsing Shabbos. But Shabbos is where Shabbos is intrinsically holy and is removed from and beyond anything of the daytime mundane realities. There's nothing to worry about, there's nothing to avoid, there's nothing to protect. The only thing that a person could ever do to disturb Shabbos is to break Shabbos. That's why it's called chilul, from the word chol, taking something which was holy and making it like it's mundane. So if our focus is Shabbos, and Eruv Tavshillin is to add value to Shabbos, what is Shabbos about? Shabbos is a day of goodness and holiness and light, so it's to increase goodness and holiness and light. And that will give us a deeper insight. A deeper insight into why the Alter Rebbe quoted Rava's opinion and Rav Ashi's opinion in the reverse order of how they were brought in the Gemara. Rav Ashi he brings first, where the Alter Rebbe first speaks about the importance of protecting the dignity of Yom Tov, but then speaks about increasing the dignity of Shabbos. Why? Because he's talking about how a person progresses in their spiritual development. Hascholas ho'avoida, the beginning of a person's spiritual development, tam aleph, and therefore brought as the first reason is the avoida von sumera. The first step of spiritual development is avoiding those things that are toxic. Kela bisman the yontiv michol, just like you avoid the mundanity of time by creating a yontiv, a space of holiness. So the first thing you focus on is harbis bichvoid yontiv, to strengthen the yontiv elements of your service of Hashem. Und erst dann noch kann man zukommen zu dem Herren von Avoid Tama Beis. Then you can graduate to the more advanced way that you serve Hashem, laharbis bichvoid Shabbos, which is to add more Shabbos in the world, which is Vasei Tov Kanal, doing the positive. Und das ist die Asbara, was der Chatchila darf man sich neg sein fi Tama Beis. That also explains, by the way, why the Alter Rebbe says, Lechatchila, what should you keep in mind? You can fulfill your obligation of Eruv Tavshillin only thinking along the lines of Rabbi, and you could actually eat the food on Yom Tov. But ideally you should consider Rav's opinion and make that your focus. But if you miss it, you're still kosher. Which of course would be Rav Ashi's opinion. The one thing every one of us has to apply at all times and all spaces, and if we don't apply it, we're losing our whole Judaism, is avoidance of that which is unhealthy. Every single Jew, without exception, has to avoid the things that Torah forbids. But to reach a point where there is no possibility of something negative, everything is beautiful, everything is pure, and not just that I act in a way that is correct, but that there is no possibility of bad, is most people are not going to get there. And the Rebbe is in Ir nito de inyan von leikuva. Therefore, it's not something which is required. And that would be similar to the difference between a tzaddik and a beinani. Every person can be a beinani. Not everybody can be or should be a tzaddik. And like every person can practice iskafa, which is avoidance of the negative, not everybody can succeed in isapcha, which is the transformation of negative into positive. So leikuva, what is the red line that nobody should cross? Is sumera. Von deswegen darf man sich neg sein lefi Tama Beis. Yet Alter Rebbe says lichatchila, in the first instance, you should follow the opinion of Rava and try and infuse that into your service of Hashem. Meaning, it's explained in multiple places in Chassidus as kedei de avoid von iskafia soll sein ki de boy v'amitis. If we want our iskafia, our avoidance of negative behaviors or thoughts, to be as healthy as possible, we have to have at least a little bit of somewhere in our spiritual development where we also transform negative into positive, even if it's occasional. You hear similar language from the Rebbe Rashab and Kuntres Eitz Chaim when he speaks about Yichudei Ilah, which is the supreme level of absolute oneness with Hashem, that there's nothing else besides Hashem, versus Yehuda Tata, which is the idea of things uniting with Hashem. If you're at the Yehuda Ilah level, then the way you're working with the world is you're transforming negative to positive. And as long as you're still at the Yehuda Tata level, then the way you're working with the world is iskafia, staying away from the negative. As kedei de avoida von Yehuda Tata, so zayin kedei boy v'amitis, says the Rebbe Rashab in Kuntres Eitz Chaim, if you want your avoida at the level of Yehuda Tata to be proper, you've got to have some Yehuda Ilah work in your life. Even if it's something that you really can never actually experience for real, and certainly not in a consistent way. So what should our aspiration be? Is hapcha, to be something of a tzaddik, to have an experience of Yehuda Ilah. Dazu is memoisef noch ein. And then the Alter Rebbe adds something else. Not only is the ideal aspiration to at least have some taste of tzaddik in our lives, but there's a minhag brought in Shulchan Aruch, which tells you it's a very solid minhag, Nutzen the Eruv Tavshillin by the Suda Shlishis, that we're supposed to keep the Eruv Tavshillin all the way to the third meal at the end of Shabbos, Why is that relevant? Because because Suda Shlishis has two opposite concepts that live together. The Eruv great meant to Eruv Yom Tov. On the one hand, in order to prepare an Eruv Tavshillin, it has to be not only before Shabbos, but before Yom Tov. Gor in Tchilas Avoda. Right at the very beginning of our spiritual development, when we haven't even begun the Avoda represented by Yom Tov, we haven't even yet begun Sur Meirah. That's where the Eruv Tavshillin begins. Yet what does it show us? That every one of us has the potential, even before we've begun our process of spiritual development, to greaten sich, that we can have a focus and a preparation. Need not tzedakah Shabbos bichlal. Not only that we can reach the level of Shabbos, which is the level of the tzaddik. So we haven't even begun the avodah of a Beinoni, and yet our focus already is what? The Suda Shlishis, looking at Shabbos, looking at achieving a tzaddik-like experience. And not just Shabbos, need not tzedakah Shabbos bichlal. Now, but our focus and aspiration is to reach Suda Shlishis, deriving the highest level of Shabbos, the highest level of tzaddik. Even though you can say, but I'm just starting out. I'm a rookie. I don't know what I'm doing. By doing something practically that is associated with Shabbos, the Suda Shlishis, that will help the person, that where they are at their stage of avodah, which could be very rudimentary, it will be done in the best, most wholesome way, and that will bring a person to a higher level of commitment to Hashem, and a higher level, until eventually a level that we could never have imagined possible.